Hello and welcome to Season 7 of the MRX Lab podcast, the show from FlexMR, where this year we're on a mission to help share with you inspiring stories, tips and tricks about how to put customers at the heart of business decisions. To help me do that, today I'm thrilled to be joined by our CMO, Chris Martin. Chris, welcome to the show. I'm going to start just by exploring the topic of customer salience in more detail. At the end of last year, we ran the highly successful second Customer Salience Summit. So my question to you is, why is it that you think that topic is resonating so strongly with end brand clients?
Okay. So first of all, thank you for having me on the show. I hosted this for about 5 years, and it is bizarre to now be sat on the other side in a much more professional setup. This is fantastic. In terms of your question, why does customer salience resonate? I think there's a couple reasons. First of all, we're tapping into something that's already known. We're tapping into marketing science and what we already know about brand salience. So we already know that when you have customers thinking about your brand in a purchase context, they're more likely to buy. That's a proven pathway. But what we're doing is we're kind of riffing off of that to flip the script, to invert it, and reflect back into organizations, how often are your decision makers thinking about customers? I mean, that's the basic premise of customer salience. But we're using ideas that are already out there, and we're also tapping into this tension that a lot of insight professionals feel, which is that our data, our advice, the truths we uncover don't reach far enough, wide enough, long enough that it might be okay to do a single debrief and maybe that gets taken forward. But what is that really impacting in the business? What is our commercial voice? What is our long-term contribution to the strategy of a brand? And I think there is a desire for a lot of researchers to have more input, to kind of put customer concerns, and we've seen the data that customer experience, customer service is stagnating or slipping in a lot of cases. There are real concerns around what the customer preferences, expectations are, and we're tapping into these concerns that they need to be given more focus. And to give them more focus, we don't need more data, we need more understanding of how businesses operate.
So just on that, really interesting points you make there, but how do we know that customers aren't necessarily taken into consideration in decision making in that way? How do we know that that's not actually, we intuitively might feel it, but is there any evidence to say that we know that they're not being considered enough in that?
Sure. So that's a tough question, and a lot of it is qualitative. I think for our audience listening at work or at home, a lot of this is about feeling. A lot of this is about looking around your organization and saying, how are the decisions being made? Who has the power? Who has the control over decision making? And frequently, that is finance departments, commercial strategy. Marketing is very much end of pipe, but we'd like to think that marketing has this very strategic role of bringing a product or service to market and is involved all the way along the line. In reality, in my experience and the experience of a lot of marketers, we're involved kind of at the very end. A product has been developed elsewhere, there is a commercial, there's a revenue strategy, and we're asked, okay, so how do we make that work? And customer insight is a part of that process. And if we're just a part of that process, there's this whole kind of world of decisions that we're not reaching.
It's a very interesting point that marketing is the sort of end of the chain. A lot of businesses are therefore almost run from the revenue, product, commercial angle first and foremost. And I guess what you're kind of arguing there is that to be customer centric, it needs to begin with the customer and end with the customer. which is a very, very difficult thing to do when you consider the role that finance accounts has in a commercial context. Is there any sort of strategies that are shared at the summits that we run and things you read that you think are very pertinent to that point? Is it, we always talk about the top table. Is it the top table that matters? Because that leads me to think it is about the top table where the finance is. Or is it more about trying to get decision making, all of those product decisions, all of those other decisions to permeate the whole of the culture of the business? Where's the tension, do you think, between those things?
That's a really good question. So in terms of where our focus needs to be, I think you're right in that you start with customer, you end with customer. The focus in the middle has to be organizational. It has to be about, as researchers or even as marketers, how much do we know about the culture of the organization and the context we're working in? And I would contend that our objective shouldn't be to reach the top table. The power politics and the relationship building and the minutiae of the way decisions are made practically on the ground is exactly the same at the top table, just on a different scale. If we reach a seat at the top table, whether or not that seat has power is a completely different question. And more often than not, it's not the case. So rather than looking at how high can we reach in the organization, the question should be how wide can we reach? And I think the key to reaching wide is through the intangibles, is through culture. That's really hard to affect. But there's also no key organizational owner of culture. No one owns it, and therefore it just emerges, it develops. There is an opportunity for researchers to take an active hand in shaping that culture. And to your question specifically on kind of what are the tactics or what are the strategies that maybe have come out of the summit, we hear a lot about this all the time, and it's always in slightly different language, but we're touching on the same points very often, which is the way we communicate matters, who we communicate with matters. We need to have persuasive voices. It's not enough to say we're evidence-based decision making. There's evidence to support a lot of different decisions. The decision isn't made on which evidence base is the largest, it's which evidence is the most compelling. And to be compelling, you have to be persuasive. So we need to develop persuasive capabilities. We need to be connecting with colleagues across the entire organization. And that might be through lunch and learns, that might be through roundtables, through email digests. We heard at last year's summit of some really interesting work on how newsletters were able to kind of start small and break barriers from just thinking about customers as data points, as NPS scores, and into being real human beings. We also need to connect customers with decision makers, people to people. It's a lot harder to make a decision which negatively affects the customer if you've met them, if you know who they are. The old adage of walking 100 miles in someone else's shoes, yeah, there's a reason there's that saying. So I think there's a huge amount of ways we can think about inserting customer into organizational culture. The question is, which of the tactics is your business going to respond to, and who is going to respond to it? We heard last year from Jane Frost at the MRX as well about relationships being more important than transactions. A lot of research is done in a transactional way. A stakeholder comes and says, I'd like this piece of data to maybe support this decision that I've already made, or ideally to help make this decision. That's transactional though. What matters is less the output that you give them and the relationship you're able to build with that person and the long-term impact you're able to have on them, and then repeating that across as many departments, people, areas of the business as you can. That's how you start to affect a culture.
Which I think is an excellent point. I remember making a point myself during the summit around the impact that structure can have on culture. And we need to think about those two things. If you're going to connect customer at the top to culture at the bottom, we often don't think about that process. So I think ownership is a fantastic point. Who owns it? But I think all too many times we're often constrained by structure, which is where your relationship point, I think, comes in. Are you suggesting there that we need to be braver as individuals to build relationships? Because I'm just a little bit worried that if we talk about relationships and we're sitting in a linear structure, the risk is we build the relationships in that structure, we build them in the mold of that structure, which effectively means we go up and down, which isn't going to necessarily affect the culture in the way that you're suggesting. So I'm a little bit interested and concerned at the same time about how we deal with that. Is that about braveness? Is it courage? Is it process? Are there tactics that we need to build in to the way we behave as individuals to try and build those relationships and not be constrained by structure?
I'm glad you asked that question. In social sciences, there's always this tension between, and this isn't just organizations, this is this isn't just businesses, this is any organization, any form of hierarchy, any set of relationships between humans and even beyond humans into the natural world and things. In social sciences, there's this huge tension between what comes first, agency, the things that we can do as people, or structure, the kind of physical and social limitations of where we are and who we are. And in truth, they're recursive, they affect each other. But I think we also have to be really careful not to place responsibility for change on individuals. So yes, we should absolutely be braver in making the points we want to make. We should be taking more steps towards actively influencing culture in the way that we want to see it shaped. But we can't say, for example, that a lack of customer culture is a failure of a research or a marketing team, because we are constrained by the structures we exist in. And I think it's really important to think of it in that kind of dyadic way of structure affects the agency we have, and the agency we have affects the structure. I think there's a couple ways we can overcome it. None of them are straightforward. The first one that I like to think about is finding what you might call positive deviance. So other like-minded people in the organization who sense that something isn't right, there's a change they want to make, and are willing to help you make that change. That's about building relationships. And that's not about building relationships within your current structure. So it's not about saying, who's my boss or who else is in my team who can help with this. It's about building those unusual bedfellow type relationships across the organization, and maybe more so what we might consider a coalition of support. That's one way I think we can tackle the structural problem. Beyond that, I do think there is a role for, as we said before, braver voices, more confidence in our findings and the direction that we want to shape the organization, and also tools like Customer Salience. Ultimately, Customer Salience doesn't exist. It's something we have, to a degree, made up. It is a framing for a real problem that exists. And hopefully, maybe as we continue to work on it more, we will get to a point where we can quantify it, or we can explain it better, or we can have more depth to its power. But we shouldn't forget that Customer Salience is just a label or a frame for a related set of complex problems. But using it helps give us power. So if we can use and talk about Customer Salience and quantify it and measure it, and be very relentless in being aligned on what it means to be salient, to what it means to give customers voice, impact on culture, and also show what that leads to. Build the evidence base, build the persuasive evidence base. Those kind of tools are what will help slowly, because structural shifts are always slow. That's what will help shift structure over time.
Very, very interesting points on that. the thing that comes to mind as you're talking is that although I've got my structure, I know where the boss is, I know who I delegate to, I know the budget process, and I need to know those things. The thing that I need to overlay it, what's in my head, is almost like a network of people. And if I can think of it in terms of network and how we join those networks together, then I'm not constrained by that culture. And my network is almost champions the coalition that you spoke of. And that isn't that you need top, you need bottom, you need middle in there as well. And then that network is about influence, and that's the coalition. So that's that's in my head. Is that a fair?
That's exactly right. So when we talk about, the structure is socially constructed, we are constrained by our own framing. We think of structure as lines of responsibility, as line management in an organization, as departments, as these things that we've made up. But there are other invisible structures in the organization. One of those is your network, your coalition of customer salience advocates.
But here's the difficulty. Here's the difficulty with this, because it's about that, which feels strategic. It feels long term, and how you balance that with the everyday. By which I mean, we talked about transactional research. It reminds me of my argument that we're far too focused on project. So when you think about a project comes in with a brief. I've got an objective. I've got a question I need answering. I create a process to do it. I answer it. I move on. Whereas culture is built over time in the long term. So I want really, in my point, I want to think about programs, things that I can put in place that influence that network on a continuous basis, that create a heartbeat, a pulse, if you like, through that network. Because if I don't, I'm only doing the transactional bit. But the crux of the difficulty for me is here, organizations are by nature transactional. And the teams are created with a role in mind, which also brings to mind something that we've talked about before, is task orientation in that summit, which is task orientation is that thing where we're so focused on the role and the outcome and the target and the KPI that we as a team too, we've become blinkered to everything else around us. And that stops us, it constrains us again. It's another invisible structure, the framing that we put on ourselves. The difficulty for me there is the organization is asking me to operate in that role-based way. I've got KPIs to do it. I've got a role. I've got a job to do. It's asking me to transact in a certain way because it's got its own strategies and objectives to fulfill, which drives to the project. So how do I balance, which is a really difficult question, how do I balance those two things? How do I balance my day job, if you like, because you're almost asking me to do a day job. How do I balance that with almost this long-term thing, which is, I'm thinking, how do I do it and should I do it?
When I opened my answer to one of your previous questions, I said it's really important that we don't place responsibility, especially responsibility for failure, on individuals. And that's exactly why. Because as much as these things sound great in theory, the practical reality is you do have a day job. As a researcher, you do have KPIs to hit. You do have specific tasks that have to be done, jobs to be done. And it's fine to do that. It's fine not to have the capacity, especially if you're in a high pressure environment, to try and take on this big challenge of shifting organizational culture too. It doesn't have to be your job. But there are some things that can be done on a day-to-day basis. So I like to think of, I'm going to go a bit left field with this example. What we say and when we say it matters and shapes thinking long term. So if you watch the news in the UK, most segments will conclude with a weather report, where there's a huge topic of conversation in the UK. If you watch a lot of news segments in the US, you'll notice that a lot of them will end with an economic outlook, with stocks and shares, right? And what that contributes to is a culture which is highly financialized and highly focused on the performance of those stocks and shares. Obviously, that's a very kind of high-level example, but if I can just bring it down, one thing that you might consider doing is at the end of every report, what's your weather outlook or what's your economic outlook? What's the one thing you want to bring every report back to at the very end that will, over time, start shaping something bigger?
Which is interesting because that did come in the summit, I remember. And what's in my mind is culture is linked to habits and rituals. I always remember that from my management graduate days is culture is built through habits and rituals. We don't know it, but if you stop and analyse culture, people talk about it, and what you find is artifacts, rituals and habits. So actually that is something practical that I think what you're saying is we can do through our day-to-day job, but also just stepping back and thinking about the creation of habits and rituals that we always try to adhere to, and that will help influence the network while still delivering the day job. Is that a fair reflection?
Yeah. So I think also what you're speaking to there is somewhat what we would call social practice theory, where culture and just things that exist are these arrangements of doings and sayings. So if we want to affect change, it's not just the immediate impact, but what we're doing and how we do it and how we say it also matters, because those are habits that will form over time, and habits spread. So yeah, I absolutely think habits, artifacts, are important things to be thinking about, and even if they're small, the practices that we develop can grow. I really think back to Ellie Osborne's presentation at the summit, and starting with just a few small changes. She talked about building momentum, and that's really what this is as well. You don't have to start with the grand challenge. You can start small and grow.
But it wasn't just that presentation. I was thinking, I had Julia's in my mind when she talked about leadership rituals. And again, it's another example where culture is being built through a ritual of customer. And so there was another practical thing that you could do. There was another, I think, example in the pitch battle debate, which wasn't newsletters, it was podcasts and WhatsApp videos. I think it was the winner of the pitch battle, which is another habit and ritual that had been created that was highly successful. And all of them, I guess, are building momentum in that.
Yeah. There's, I spend a lot of my time in Tokyo interviewing companies across Japan. And one of the really interesting, without overgeneralizing, this is not across the board, but one of the interesting habits that a lot of companies have is a morning song, a morning company song. And maybe it sounds a little bit silly to us, but what it does is it does build, in that context, employee loyalty and trust and a relationship between the organization and employees. What's our customer song? What is the thing that we're going to do every day that builds in a habitual way the relationship between decision makers and customers?
Which is a great point to try and end on. But I'm also coming back to your beginning point, which is almost one of humanizing the customer. Again, Ellie's presentation comes to mind, but humanizing it, because so much of organization is built on numbers, right? We need to quantify everything. And so much of research has actually been based on statistical significance and survey data. And still today, that's what the majority of people do. And yet, really, it's the humanization of this and the socialization that will influence people. Is that it? Am I right in that, or am I?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And to add another lisation to that, I think this stems from the financialization of business as well. It's really hard for finance to talk to humanization. It's really hard for finance to talk to qual. If you want to do ROI, RORI measurements, you need numbers to input into that calculation, which we can convert into some kind of monetary format. How you talk about human relationships really doesn't mesh well with the world of finance. And I think there is a broader call here, not just to put customers first and put customers into organizational culture, but kind of claw back a bit of the power into the humanizing and the qualitative side of businesses away from the financialization of decision making.
which I think is a great note to end on. I think we've almost been quite circular in our discussion, which I think is fantastic. So thank you again, Chris, for joining us, for joining me today to talk about these things. And thank you too to the audience for tuning in too. We may be out of time today, but I'll be back next month with another episode and more inspiring stories of how to put customer insight at the heart of decisions. Until then, I've been your host, Paul Hudson, and this has been MRX Lab.